Hey guys, tonight we are stepping into the marble halls of ancient Rome, where the bathhouses steamed, the emperors schemed, and men loved other men with a casualness that would make your conservative uncle's head spin like a chariot wheel. Forget everything Hollywood taught you about Rome. So before you get comfortable, take a moment to like the video and subscribe, but only if you genuinely enjoy what I do here. And let me know in the comments where you are tuning in from and what time it is for you. It is always fascinating to see who is joining us from around the world. Now dim the lights, maybe turn on a fan for that soft background hum, and let us ease into tonight's journey together. But seriously, have you ever wondered what two Roman soldiers actually did after a long day of conquering Gaul? Or how a teenage slave boy caught the eye of the most powerful man in the world? Have you thought about what it meant when a senator called another man his beloved in official correspondence? What happened in those bathhouse back rooms that every Roman pretended not to notice? How did Roman wives feel about their husbands' teenage boyfriends? And honestly, what is the Latin term for sliding into someone's DMs when your DMs are carved into a bathhouse wall? Welcome to Rome. Not the sanitized textbook version, the real one, where same-sex desire was so woven into daily life that they barely had a word for being gay because the concept of sexual identity as we know it did not exist yet. Let us see what they really did, and to whom. Good luck. The first thing you need to understand about Roman sexuality is this. They did not care who you slept with. They cared about what you did in bed. More specifically, they cared obsessively about whether you were the one doing the penetrating or the one being penetrated, because Roman society was not built on heterosexual versus homosexual, it was built on dominant versus submissive, active versus passive, conqueror versus conquered. Your social status, your legal rights, your entire reputation hinge not on the gender of your sexual partner, but on your role during the act itself. If you were a Roman citizen man and you took the active role with another man, a woman, or frankly a hole in the wall, no one blinked. You were performing masculinity correctly. You were the penetrator, the conqueror, Rome in human form. But if you were a Roman citizen man, and you allowed yourself to be penetrated by anyone, you had just committed social suicide. The Latin word for this was impudicitia, shamelessness. Sexual passivity was considered so degrading for a free Roman man that it could cost you your citizenship rights, your ability to hold public office, your honor, your family name, and your spot in the Senate faster than you could say Gaius Julius Caesar. Roman law actually had provisions allowing prosecution of free men who willingly submitted to penetration by other men. Not because it was gay, because it was passive. Because passivity was the role of women, slaves, and foreigners. Never citizens, never conquerors, never real men. And this is where Roman sexuality gets deeply, disturbingly hierarchical. Roman men could and did have sexual relationships with other males constantly. But almost always those other males were slaves, freedmen, prostitutes, or adolescent boys of lower social status, never their equals. The moment you stepped into the passive role with someone of your own class, you had violated the unspoken social contract of Roman masculinity. You had made yourself woman-like, conquered, weak, the worst thing a Roman man could be. This was not about homophobia as we understand it. This was about power. Let me introduce you to a real person, Gaius Valerius Catullus, born around 84 BCE, Roman poet, and absolutely shameless about his desire for a young man named Juventus. Catullus wrote poems to Juventus that historians spent centuries trying to explain away as friendship. They were not friendship poems. In poem 48, Catullus writes, "If I were allowed to go on giving kisses to your honeyed eyes, Juventus, I would kiss them 300,000 times and never feel I had had enough." In poem 99, he describes stealing a kiss from the boy while he was playing. These were not subtle. These were not coded. Catullus was writing publicly, in Latin, about his overwhelming lust for a teenage boy, and he published these poems during his lifetime without fear of legal repercussion. Because he was the active partner, the pursuer, the penetrator. No one cared. But Catullus also wrote Poem 16, and this one gets dark. Another poet named Aurelius and a man named Furius had apparently criticized Catullus's poems as being too soft, too effeminate, too passive. So Catullus responded with one of the most aggressive poems in Latin literature. It opens with the line, Pedicabo ego vos et irumabo, which translates roughly to, I will sodomize you and face fuck you. He is not threatening them with violence in the modern sense. He is threatening them with sexual humiliation, with forced passivity, with penetration, because that was the worst thing you could do to a Roman man. Reduce him to the role of a woman or a slave. Make him the conquered. This is what Rome really did. It built an entire sexual culture where gay sex was everywhere, openly acknowledged, frequently celebrated, but only if you maintained the correct power dynamic. Only if you stayed on top, literally. The bathhouses were the epicenter of Roman male sexuality. Every city had them, every neighborhood. They were part community center, part gym, part social club, and part hookup spot. Roman men spent hours there every single day, moving through hot rooms and cold plunges, getting massaged with olive oil, scraping themselves clean with curved metal tools called strigils, and absolutely noticing each other's bodies. The bathhouses were designed for it. Open pools, shared spaces, nudity everywhere. And in the back rooms, the private massage rooms, the dim corners by the furnaces, things happened that everyone knew about and no one officially acknowledged. We know this because of graffiti. Pompeii and Herculaneum were buried by the eruption of Mount Vesuvius in 79 CE, which means their walls were preserved exactly as Romans left them. And Roman men wrote on those walls. In bathhouses, in brothels, on random street corners. They wrote about sex constantly. Secundus defecated here appears next to Gaius was here and fucked a boy. One piece of graffiti in a Pompeii bathhouse reads, on April 19th, I made bread. Right next to it, Cosmus, the slave of Equitia, is the biggest catamite. Catamite. That is the Latin term for the passive partner in male-male sex, usually a slave or a young boy. It was not a compliment. But here is the thing. Cosmus was being mocked, not for having gay sex, for being penetrated, for being passive. If the graffiti had said, Cosmus the slave fucked 20 boys at the baths, no one would have cared. That would have been masculine, dominant, acceptable. The crime was submission, and submission was reserved for people who had no choice. Slavery in Rome was brutal. Tens of thousands of enslaved people lived in the city itself. Millions across the empire. Slaves had zero legal rights over their own bodies. A master could use a slave sexually whenever he wanted. Male slaves especially occupied this degrading middle category in Roman sexuality. They were male-bodied, but they were expected to submit sexually, to be passive, to be penetrated because they were property, not citizens, not men. They were literally called pueri, boys, even when they were adults, because the word carried connotations of youthful, passive availability. We have explicit accounts of this. The poet Martial, writing in the late 1st century CE, made jokes constantly about slave boys being used sexually by their masters. In one poem, he mocks a man for being too attracted to his own slave boy, saying the master cannot keep his hands off the lad. In another, he describes a slave boy so beautiful that men line up to bid on him at auction, not for labor, but for his looks. This was normal, expected, joked about in published poetry, and these boys had no recourse. If a master wanted to rape his slave, that was not even considered rape under Roman law. Rape required force against a person with legal rights. Slaves did not have legal rights. The modern term for what happened to enslaved boys in Roman households is systematic sexual abuse. Romans called it ownership. Let me tell you about the Emperor Hadrian. He ruled from 117 to 138 CE, successful military leader, brilliant administrator, built a wall across Britain, and absolutely, publicly, obsessively in love with a teenage boy from Bithynia named Antinous. Antinous was probably around 13 when Hadrian met him. The emperor was in his 40s. Antinous was beautiful, dark-haired, Greek features, exactly the type Roman aristocrats fetishized. Hadrian took him as his lover. Not secretly, not shamefully, openly. He brought Antinous with him everywhere, to military campaigns, to government functions, to the Senate. Hadrian's wife, Vibia Sabina, was still alive, still officially empress, and everyone in Rome knew the emperor was sleeping with a teenage boy. No one cared. Because Hadrian was the emperor, the ultimate active partner, the conqueror of the known world. He could do whatever he wanted, and he loved Antinous. The historical record actually suggests this was more than just sexual exploitation, though the power imbalance makes that complicated. Hadrian wrote poetry about Antinous. He kept him close for years, and when Antinous drowned in the Nile River in 130 CE under mysterious circumstances, Hadrian lost his mind with grief. He declared Antinous a god, an actual deity. He founded a city in Egypt named Antinopolis in the boy's honor. He commissioned thousands of statues of Antinous and placed them throughout the empire. More statues than any other private individual in Roman history. Even today, if you walk through a major museum with a Roman collection, you will see Antinous. Marble eyes, curled hair, the most famous gay teenager in ancient history. But here is the question no one asks. Did Antinous have a choice? He was not a slave. He was from a free provincial family. But he was a youth, a foreign youth, and Hadrian was the emperor, the most powerful man on the planet. When the emperor says he wants you, when he offers you a life of unimaginable luxury and proximity to godlike power, can you say no? Would you? The romantic story says Antinous loved Hadrian back. The cynical story says a 13-year-old boy from Bithynia had no real agency when the emperor decided to claim him. Both stories might be true. History rarely gives us clean answers. What history does give us is evidence. And the evidence says Rome built a sexual culture where older men routinely took adolescent boys as lovers. And this was so common, it had formal social rules. The Greeks had started this tradition centuries earlier with pederasty, literally boy love, where an older man, the Erastes, would court and mentor a teenage boy, the Eromenos. Romans adopted a version of this, though they were generally more blunt and less philosophical about it. They just liked young men. Teenage boys, smooth skin, no beards yet. The aesthetic ideal of Roman male beauty was almost always adolescent. The poet Virgil, yes, the one who wrote the Aeneid, also wrote a collection of shorter poems called the Eclogues. In the second eclogue, a shepherd named Corydon laments his unrequited love for a beautiful boy named Alexis, who belongs to Corydon's master. "Cruel Alexis, do you care nothing for my songs?" Corydon cries. He describes Alexis's beauty, his indifference, the pain of loving someone who does not love you back. This poem was taught in Roman schools. Children read it. Because the love of a man for a beautiful boy was not scandalous. It was literature. And it was everywhere. We find it in philosophy. The Roman Stoic philosopher Seneca wrote about the temptations of beautiful slave boys and warned against becoming too attached to them. Not because loving them was wrong, but because attachment to anything was philosophically dangerous. In his letters, he casually mentions men who fall in love with their slaves as a common moral hazard. We find it in political smears. When Romans wanted to destroy someone's reputation, they did not accuse them of sleeping with men. They accused them of being penetrated by men. The difference was everything. Julius Caesar was rumored to have had an affair with King Nicomedes of Bithynia when Caesar was a young man. His political enemies used this against him for decades, calling him the Queen of Bithynia. Not because he slept with a man, because supposedly he had been the passive partner. He had submitted to a foreign king. That was the scandal. Caesar had to spend years publicly proving his hyper-masculine credentials, conquering Gaul, sleeping with other men's wives, projecting dominance in every possible way, just to bury that one rumor. Meanwhile, everyone knew Caesar's close friend and political ally, the general Mark Antony, had a male lover named Curio when he was younger. No one cared. Antony had been the dominant partner. Rome did not punish men for loving men. It punished men for loving men in the wrong position. Let me take you to the legal side. The Lex Scantinia was a Roman law, probably passed around 149 BCE, that supposedly regulated sexual behavior between free males. Historians argue endlessly about what exactly this law said, because no full text survives. But the general consensus is that it penalized free men who either willingly took the passive role in same-sex intercourse or who forced freeborn boys into sexual acts. Notice what it did not ban: consensual sex between a man and his slave. Sex with prostitutes. Sex with foreigners. Those were fine. The crime was violating the sexual integrity of another free Roman citizen, making him passive, making him like a woman. Very few prosecutions under this law are recorded, and when they happened, they were almost always politically motivated. Sexual accusations were weapons, tools. When you wanted to destroy a rival in the Senate, you whispered that he liked being penetrated. You spread rumors that he had submitted to a slave. You questioned his manhood, not his sexuality, his masculinity, his position in the hierarchy, and the hierarchy was everything. Roman society was obsessed with rank: citizen versus non-citizen, freeborn versus freed, slave versus free, man versus woman, active versus passive. Every interaction was defined by who had power over whom. Sex was just another expression of that power. When a Roman man penetrated a slave, he was asserting dominance. When he penetrated a prostitute, same thing. When he penetrated a foreign captive, he was literally embodying Rome's conquest of the world. Sex was political. Sex was power. And gay sex was just sex. This is the hidden truth your history teacher skipped. Rome was not progressive. It was not a gay paradise. It was a deeply hierarchical, often brutal society that allowed same-sex desire to exist openly because that desire reinforced existing power structures. Men could love men, sleep with men, obsess over men, write poetry to men, all without shame, as long as they maintained their dominant role, as long as they stayed on top, as long as the person beneath them was a slave, a prostitute, a foreigner, or a boy, someone without full rights, someone who could be conquered. For the men on the bottom, it was a different story entirely. If you were a slave boy in a Roman household and your master wanted you, you submitted. If you were a prostitute working the streets near the Colosseum, you took whoever paid. If you were a foreign teenager brought to Rome as a captive, you survived however you could. These men and boys were everywhere in Roman sexual life, but their voices are almost completely absent from the historical record. We have the poems of the men who desired them. We do not have their responses. History is written by the penetrators, but we do have glimpses. Graffiti in Pompeii gives us tiny windows into lives that otherwise disappeared. One piece of graffiti, scrawled on a bathhouse wall, reads, "Felix the slave, I hope you get fucked." It is meant as an insult, but it also tells us Felix existed. Someone hated him enough to write his name. Another reads, "Fortunatus, you sweet soul, you are a great cocksucker." Was this an insult or a compliment? Was Fortunatus a prostitute advertising his skills? Was someone mocking him? We will never know. All we have is his name on a wall and the knowledge that he probably sold his body to survive in a city that gave him no other options. The prostitutes were everywhere. Male prostitutes. Prostituti, in Latin. They worked in brothels, in the streets, near the theatres, at the baths. Some were slaves, forced into sex work by their masters who kept the profits. Some were freedmen, former slaves trying to survive in a society that offered them almost no legitimate work. Some were freeborn citizens who had fallen into poverty and had nothing left to sell but themselves. And once you sold yourself sexually as a free man, even once, you lost your citizen rights. Forever. Because you had allowed yourself to be penetrated. You had made yourself passive. You had become like a woman. Roman law called this infamia, infamy, legal disgrace. Male prostitutes could not vote, could not hold office, could not testify in court except under torture. They were permanent social outcasts. But they were also essential to the sexual economy of Rome. Thousands of men used their services, openly. The poet Horace jokes in his writings about visiting male prostitutes because they are cheaper and easier than courting respectable women. He is not ashamed. He published this, and the boys kept working because they had no choice. Let me tell you about the Emperor Elagabalus. He ruled from 218 to 222 CE. He was 14 when he became emperor. And according to ancient historians, he scandalized Rome by taking the passive role. The sources on Elagabalus are hostile, deeply hostile. Written by senators and historians who hated him and wanted to destroy his memory after his assassination. So we have to read them carefully. But even accounting for exaggeration and bias, the accounts agree on this. Elagabalus preferred to be penetrated. He allegedly took male lovers and insisted on being the passive partner. He supposedly wore makeup, dressed in women's clothing, called himself the wife of his male partners. And according to the historian Cassius Dio, he once asked physicians if they could surgically create a vagina for him. Rome lost its mind, not because Elagabalus loved men. Emperors before him had loved men openly. Hadrian literally deified his boyfriend. But Elagabalus had violated the fundamental rule. He had made himself passive. He had made himself woman-like. He had degraded the imperial office by submitting sexually. The Senate could not tolerate it. 3 years into his reign, the Praetorian Guard assassinated him. He was 18 years old. They killed his mother too. Then they dragged his body through the streets, mutilated it, and threw it in the Tiber River. They wanted to erase him from history. Modern scholars debate what was really happening with Elagabalus. Some think he might have been transgender, not gay, and that his desire for a vagina was an early expression of gender dysphoria. Some think the whole story was invented by hostile sources to justify his murder. Some think he was just a teenager with unlimited power, experimenting with sexuality in ways that horrified the conservative Senate. We will never know his real interior life. But we know Rome's response. They murdered him for being passive, for violating the sexual hierarchy, for being, in their eyes, too much like a woman. This was the line. You could love men. You could sleep with men. You could marry men in informal ceremonies that Romans absolutely held, though not legally recognized. But you could never, ever be the woman in the relationship if you were supposed to be a man. You could never submit. You could never bottom. That was the hidden truth of Roman sexuality. It was not about who you loved. It was about who you conquered. And that conquest extended into marriage itself. Because Roman men did marry each other, not legally. Roman law defined marriage, matrimonium, as a union between a man and a woman for the purpose of producing legitimate children. Same-sex couples could not access that legal framework, but they held ceremonies anyway, private rituals, exchange of vows, witnesses, rings, everything but the legal paperwork. The Emperor Nero married a freedman named Pythagoras in a public ceremony around 64 CE, and according to the historian Tacitus, Nero took the role of the bride. He wore a bridal veil. The whole court attended, and once again, the scandal was not that Nero married a man. The scandal was that he took the passive feminine role. He made himself the bride. That was the violation. Nero also married another man named Sporus. But this time, Nero played the groom. He had Sporus castrated first, then dressed him in women's clothing and married him in a formal ceremony. The sources treat these two marriages completely differently. When Nero married Pythagoras as the bride, the historians are horrified, disgusted, full of contempt. When Nero married Sporus as the groom, forcing Sporus into the feminine role, the tone shifts. It is still presented as excessive, as tyrannical, but not as degrading to Nero himself. Because Nero maintained the active role, he was still the man. Sporus was the one unmanned. We have evidence of other same-sex unions. The poet Martial describes a wedding between two men named Callistratus and Afer, where Callistratus wore a bridal veil. Martial mocks it, of course, calling it absurd and unnatural. But he also confirms it happened. These ceremonies existed. They were rare, probably limited to the wealthy and powerful who could afford to ignore social conventions, but they happened. Roman men found ways to formalize their relationships with other men, even when the law would not recognize them, and some of those relationships lasted for years. The Emperor Trajan, who ruled from 98 to 117 CE, had a long-term relationship with a young man whose name we do not even know. The sources mention him only in passing, describing him as Trajan's favorite, his companion on military campaigns. He was just there, part of the imperial household. No one thought it remarkable enough to record details. That is how normalized these relationships were at the highest levels of power. The emperor had a boyfriend. So what? As long as he also had a wife for producing heirs and maintaining the dynastic line, no one cared who else shared his bed. But the wives knew. We have almost no sources written by Roman women about their husbands' male lovers, which makes sense because Roman women were generally not taught to write extensively, and their personal documents were not preserved the way men's were. But we have hints. Vibia Sabina, the wife of Hadrian, reportedly hated Antinous. One source claims she said she would have had the boy killed if she could have gotten away with it. Whether that is true or exaggerated, it tells us something. These women were not oblivious. They watched their husbands obsess over teenage boys, commission statues of them, write poems to them, take them on state trips while the wives stayed home. They knew. They resented it, but they had no power to stop it. Roman marriage for the elite was political, dynastic, two families merging wealth and status. Love was optional. Fidelity was expected from the wife, absolutely never from the husband. A Roman husband could sleep with slaves, prostitutes, other men, random encounters at the baths, and none of it was considered adultery, as long as the other party was not another man's wife. Only sex with a married woman of citizen status counted as adultery, because that violated another man's property rights and threatened the legitimacy of heirs. Everything else was fair game. So the wives endured. They produced children. They managed households. And they watched their husbands chase boys. Let me take you deeper into the bathhouses, because that is where the daily reality of Roman male sexuality played out. The baths were not just about getting clean. They were social institutions. Political networking happened there. Business deals were made there. Friendships formed there. And sex, constantly, in the background, like the steam rising from the hot pools. The typical Roman bathhouse, a thermae, had a specific layout. You entered through the apoditerium, the changing room, where you stripped and stored your clothes in wall niches. Then you moved through a series of heated rooms, the tepidarium, warm, the caldarium, hot, built over furnaces that roasted you until the sweat poured out. Then the frigidarium, the cold plunge pool, where you shocked your system back to equilibrium. In between, you got massaged, oiled, scraped clean with a strigil. You exercised in the palaestra, the courtyard gym. You swam in pools. You lounged in gardens. You spent hours there, and you were naked the entire time, surrounded by other naked men. The bathhouses were designed to showcase the male body, open spaces, good lighting from high windows, marble everywhere, smooth and reflective. Roman men were not shy about looking. They ranked each other constantly: who had the best physique, who was aging well, who had scars from military service, who was well endowed. The poet Martial has an entire poem mocking a man who tries to hide his small penis at the baths by bathing in a tunic. Everyone noticed. Everyone commented. The male body was public property in Roman culture, and some bodies were more available than others. Slave attendants worked the baths, mostly young men and boys. They carried towels, poured oil, offered massages, and they were absolutely used sexually by the patrons. We know this from multiple sources. Seneca, in one of his moral letters, complains about the noise at the baths, and he specifically mentions the man who likes to hear his own voice while being massaged. Then he mentions the perverts who hang around looking for young attendants. He is not condemning the sex itself. He is condemning the men who are too obvious about it, too public, too shameless. The sex was happening. Everyone knew. The graffiti confirms it. In the bathhouse at Pompeii, someone carved, "Two friends were here, and because they had a bad attendant, they fucked him twice." The attendant had no choice. He was enslaved. His job was to serve the patrons. If the patrons wanted sex, he provided it. That is what Rome did to gay men who had no power. It used them, casually, constantly, and then joked about it on the walls. But there were also men who went to the baths specifically looking for other men, not as victims, as partners, equals, or close to it. The baths had reputations. Some were known as cruising spots. Men who wanted male sexual partners knew which baths to visit, which times of day, which corners and rooms. The evidence for this is scattered but consistent. Legal sources mention men lurking at baths. Medical writers warn about the dangers of bathhouse promiscuity. Poets make jokes about men who spend too much time at certain baths. It was an open secret. The baths were where you went if you wanted to find another man, and the mechanics of it were probably not that different from a modern sauna or bathhouse in a gay neighborhood. Eye contact, lingering looks, following someone into a private room. The difference was that in Rome, the social acceptability of what happened next depended entirely on who penetrated whom. If both men were free citizens of equal status and they had sex, someone had to take the passive role, and that person had just committed social suicide. So these encounters were always unequal, always. A citizen and a slave, a wealthy man and a prostitute, an older man and a younger man of lower status. The hierarchy had to be maintained even in casual sex, unless both men agreed to hide it. And they must have. There must have been Roman men who loved each other as equals, who had sex in ways that violated the social rules, who switched roles, or both took pleasure in passivity, or simply did not care about the hierarchy. We just do not have their stories. The sources that survive were written by and for the elite, the men who benefited from the system. The men who broke the rules did not write about it. They could not. Admission meant legal and social destruction, so they hid. They met in private. They told no one, and history forgot them. But we know they existed because the laws kept trying to stop them. The Lex Julia de Adulteris, passed by the Emperor Augustus in 18 BCE, was mostly about adultery and marriage, but it included provisions penalizing men who prostituted themselves or willingly took the passive role. Why pass a law against something that is not happening? The law existed because men were doing it. Free-born men were selling their bodies. Citizen men were submitting sexually to other men. It was common enough that Augustus felt the need to legislate against it. The law did not stop it. It just drove it underground. And underground was where most of Roman gay life actually happened. Not the public poems and imperial boyfriends, the daily reality. The slaves who had no choice. The prostitutes working for survival. The men who loved each other in secret. The boys being passed around at dinner parties as entertainment. Let me tell you about the symposium culture. The Romans adopted this from the Greeks. A symposium was an elite drinking party, men only, that happened after the main meal. Wine flowed. Conversations ranged from philosophy to politics to dirty jokes, and entertainment was provided. Musicians, dancers, acrobats, and beautiful boys, slave boys usually, dressed attractively, serving wine, flirting with the guests, and available for sex if the guests wanted them. This was expected, normal. Pliny the Younger, a senator and author writing around 100 CE, describes attending a dinner where the host had 3 different categories of wine, 3 different qualities of food, and 3 different categories of dinner guests, all ranked by status. The finest wine and food went to the most important guests. The beautiful slave boys served them first. At these parties, the boys were decorative objects and sexual opportunities simultaneously. A wealthy Roman could call a boy over, fondle him in front of everyone, even take him to a back room during the party. And this was not scandalous. It was a display of wealth and power. Look what I own. Look what I can do. The boy's feelings were irrelevant. His consent was not a concept that existed in Roman thought. He was property, and some of those boys were very young. Roman culture was obsessed with youth, hairlessness, smooth skin. The ideal male beauty was always adolescent, hovering somewhere between 12 and 17. Adult men with beards were considered less attractive for sexual purposes. Martial has poems mocking men who still try to seduce other men after they have grown facial hair. He describes one man plucking out his beard hairs one by one to maintain a youthful appearance for his male lovers. The implication is clear. Once you looked like a full adult man, your sexual value in the eyes of other men dropped. You were supposed to age out of being desired and into being the desirer. This created a narrow window. Boys were sexually vulnerable from the moment they hit puberty until they grew a full beard, roughly ages 12 to 20. During those years, if you were enslaved or poor or had no family protection, you were prey. Elite Roman men wanted you. They would pay for you. They would take you if they could. And Roman society had no concept of protecting minors from sexual exploitation because the entire culture was built on exploitation. The strong took from the weak. Always. That was the natural order. We have to sit with how disturbing this is. Not judge it by modern standards in a way that flattens history, but actually understand what it meant. 12-year-old boys, 13-year-old boys, enslaved in Roman households, being raped by their masters and called beloved in poetry. 14-year-old prostitutes selling themselves on street corners because they had no other way to eat. 15-year-old captives from Gaul or Germania, taken in war, brought to Rome in chains, and passed around at parties for the entertainment of senators. This happened every single day, in every city in the empire, for centuries. And it was legal, more than legal. It was normalized, celebrated in literature, joked about in graffiti, integrated into the social fabric so completely that most Romans did not even see it as a problem. They saw it as life. The few Romans who objected did so not on grounds of protecting the boys, but on grounds of philosophical self-control. Stoic philosophers like Seneca and Musonius Rufus argued that men should not be enslaved to their passions, that excessive desire for boys or women was a weakness, a loss of rational control. But even they did not say the sex itself was wrong. They said wanting it too much was wrong. Moderation was the virtue. You could sleep with your slave boy, just do not become obsessed with him. Do not let desire rule you. That was the extent of Roman moral concern. Christianity changed this, slowly, very slowly. By the 4th century CE, Christianity was spreading through the empire, and Christian writers had a completely different sexual ethic. They believed sex outside of marriage was sinful. Period. All of it. Gay, straight, with slaves, with prostitutes, did not matter. If it was not between a married man and woman for procreation, it was sin. This was radical. This was new. Romans had never thought this way. The Christian writer Tertullian, writing around 200 CE, condemned Roman men for their sexual use of slaves and boys. calling it perversion and corruption. He was a minority voice at that point. Christianity was still a persecuted cult, but the seeds were planted. When the Emperor Constantine converted to Christianity in 312 CE and began to Christianize the empire, Roman sexual culture started to shift. Not immediately, not completely, but laws began to change. In 342 CE, the emperors Constantius and Constans issued a law that vaguely condemned shameful male sexuality, though scholars debate what exactly it prohibited. In 390 CE, the Emperor Theodosius issued a law explicitly calling for men who play the role of a woman to be burned alive. That law was probably not widely enforced. Enforcement of Roman laws was always inconsistent, but its existence shows the shift. The old Roman system, where passive gay sex was shameful but active gay sex was fine, was being replaced by a new Christian system where all gay sex was sinful and deserving of punishment. This did not happen overnight. The bathhouses stayed open for another century. The aristocracy kept their slave boys. Poets kept writing homoerotic verses. But the culture was changing. By the 6th century, under the Emperor Justinian, the legal code explicitly criminalized all male same-sex activity, active or passive, and prescribed death by torture as the penalty. Justinian justified this by saying gay sex caused earthquakes, famines, and plagues. It angered God. It threatened the whole empire. Rome had gone from a society where same-sex desire was everywhere, openly expressed, woven into daily life, to one where it was a capital crime. The shift took about 2 centuries, and it was Christianity that drove it, not because Christians invented homophobia, but because Christians brought a totally new framework. Sexual purity culture, the idea that bodies and desires needed to be controlled and regulated for spiritual reasons, that some acts were inherently sinful, regardless of social hierarchy. This was new. This was foreign to Roman thought, and it eventually won. But we are getting ahead. For most of Roman history, for the 8 centuries from the founding of the Republic to the rise of Christian emperors, gay sex was just sex. Common, visible, structured by power. Let me take you back to the streets, because most gay sex in Rome did not happen in marble palaces or imperial bedrooms. It happened in the suburra, the crowded working-class neighborhood near the Forum. It happened in cheap rented rooms above shops. It happened in alleyways and brothels and the dark corners of apartment buildings. The men involved were not writing poetry, they were surviving. The typical insula, a Roman apartment building, was 5 or 6 stories of crammed housing. The poor lived on the top floors, the slightly less poor on the lower floors. Noise echoed through thin walls, smells from chamber pots and cooking fires mixed into a permanent stench, and men sold sex to other men in those buildings every night. We know, because the graffiti tells us. Felix sucks cock for 1 as. An as was the smallest Roman coin. Felix was charging almost nothing. He was desperate. Another piece of graffiti. Vibius Restitutus slept here alone and missed his Urbana. Urbana was a male name. Vibius was missing his boyfriend. They existed. In the crowded insulae, in the poorest neighborhoods, men loved men and missed them and wrote their names on walls. The brothels, the lupanaria, had male prostitutes alongside female ones. The most famous brothel in Pompeii, preserved by the eruption, had 10 small rooms, each with a stone bed and an explicit fresco on the wall showing the sexual services available. Some of those frescoes depicted male-male sex. Those rooms were for male clients who wanted male prostitutes. The rooms were tiny, dark. The stone beds were covered with thin mattresses at best. This was not glamorous. This was transactional. A few coins for a few minutes. The prostitute took whoever came in. The client left. Repeat all day. And the prostitutes had names. We find them in graffiti, in receipts, in passing mentions in letters. Fortunatus, Felix, Secundus, Cosmus, Hyperion. Mostly slave names or Greek names, which tells us most male prostitutes were enslaved or foreign-born. Roman citizens who became prostitutes usually took fake names to hide their identities, because once you were known as a prostitute, you lost all citizen rights. The stigma was permanent, so they hid, worked under aliases, served clients who did not care what their real names were. Some prostitutes worked the streets independently. The spintria were male prostitutes who worked near the Circus Maximus, the great chariot racing stadium. Thousands of men attended the races, and afterward, the spintria were available. We even have coins, small bronze tokens called spintriae, that depicted explicit sexual acts on one side and a numeral on the other. Historians think these were either used as brothel tokens, tickets you bought to exchange for services, or as gambling tokens at parties. Either way, they show us what sex acts were available for purchase. Several of the spintriae depict male-male intercourse. Those acts cost the same as male-female intercourse. Same price, same transaction, just a different body. And then there were the performers. Actors in Roman theatre were almost all male, including the actors who played female roles. Acting was considered a low, shameful profession, barely above prostitution, and actors had the same legal restrictions as prostitutes. They could not hold office or vote, but they were famous, popular. Crowds adored them, and many actors, especially the young beautiful ones playing romantic leads, had wealthy male patrons who supported them financially in exchange for sexual access. This was so common it had a term, favoritism. A senator or merchant would become obsessed with a particular actor, shower him with gifts, pay off his debts, secure him better roles, all while maintaining a sexual relationship. The actor benefited from the patronage. The patron got a trophy boyfriend and social prestige from being associated with a famous performer. The Emperor Tiberius, who ruled from 14 to 37 CE, was reportedly obsessed with pantomime actors, the performers who did elaborate solo dance dramas. According to the historian Suetonius, Tiberius had young actors flogged in public for minor infractions, which historians think was a form of sadistic sexual gratification. Suetonius also claims Tiberius retired to the island of Capri and created a sex palace there, filled with enslaved boys and girls trained to perform elaborate group sex acts for his entertainment. The boys were called minnows because Tiberius allegedly enjoyed swimming in pools while they performed oral sex on him underwater. How much of this is true? Hard to say. Suetonius wrote decades after Tiberius died, and he loved scandal. But even if half of it is exaggeration, the fact that Romans found these stories believable tells us something. It was plausible that an emperor would have a private island sex compound staffed by enslaved children. That fit within the realm of Roman possibility, because absolute power meant absolute sexual access. If you were emperor, you could have anyone, do anything. The enslaved children had no recourse, no protection, no voice. Let me tell you about one who did have a voice briefly. His name was Erinus. He was a slave, later a freedman, in the household of the Emperor Domitian, who ruled from 81 to 96 CE. Erinus was a eunuch, castrated as a boy to preserve his youthful appearance. This was not uncommon. Wealthy Romans sometimes had their favorite slave boys castrated to prevent them from developing adult male features like beards and deep voices. It kept them pretty, available, perpetually boyish. Erinus became Domitian's favorite, and the poet Martial wrote several poems about him, describing his beauty, his golden hair, his grace. One poem describes Erinus dedicating a lock of his hair to a temple, a ritual usually performed by freeborn Roman boys when they came of age. Martial treats this as touching, sweet, a eunuch slave performing a citizen ritual. But read between the lines, Erinus was castrated, probably against his will, definitely before he was old enough to consent. He was kept as a sexual plaything for the emperor, and when he was finally freed, probably when he aged out of being desirable, he tried to claim some dignity by performing a citizen ritual. Martial thought this was charming. It is devastating. That was Rome, a culture that could castrate a child, rape him for years, then write poems about how beautiful he was. A culture that saw nothing wrong with this because the child was enslaved and the emperor was powerful, and power was the only morality that mattered. And yet, there were also moments of genuine affection, real love, relationships that transcended the brutal hierarchy, at least emotionally. Hadrian genuinely mourned Antinous. The grief was real, even if the power imbalance was insurmountable. Some masters freed their slave lovers and continued relationships with them as freedmen. Some men wrote wills, leaving their entire fortunes to their male partners. Legal records show cases of men living together for decades, sharing households, raising adopted children together. The system was brutal, the culture was exploitative, but humans are humans. People loved each other anyway, found ways to care for each other, built lives together in the cracks of the empire. History gives us the contradictions. We have to hold both truths. Rome allowed same-sex desire openly. Rome also created a system where that desire was almost always expressed through exploitation. Both things are true. The poems are real. The rape is real. The love is real. The slavery is real. You cannot separate them. That is what Rome really did to gay men. It gave some of them power to take pleasure from others. It gave most of them no choice at all. The military was its own world. 40 legions at the empire's height. Nearly 200,000 men living together in fortified camps on the edges of civilization. Sharing tents, bathing together, marching for days, fighting side by side, dying together. And the Roman military had very specific, very harsh rules about gay sex. Soldiers were forbidden from having sexual relationships with each other. The ban was absolute. Roman military law, outlined in military manuals and enforced by commanders, prohibited soldiers from engaging in sexual acts with fellow soldiers. The penalty was severe: beating, demotion, dishonorable discharge. In some cases, execution. This was not about morality. This was about discipline. The Roman military machine could not function if the ranks were disrupted by sexual jealousies, favoritism, or the breakdown of hierarchical command structure. Soldiers needed to see each other as brothers in arms, not sexual partners. Sexual desire introduced complications, emotions, attachments that could compromise unit cohesion. So the official line was clear: no sex between soldiers. The reality was messier. Roman military camps were all male for months, sometimes years at a time. Soldiers were mostly young men, teenagers and men in their 20s, at the peak of physical vitality and sexual desire. They were isolated from cities, from brothels, from the usual outlets for sexual release, and they were packed together in close quarters, 8 men to a tent, communal latrines, shared bathhouses in permanent camps. The proximity was constant. The temptation must have been enormous. We have evidence that it happened anyway. Legal records mention court cases involving soldiers accused of sexual relationships with each other. The historian Polybius, writing in the 2nd century BCE, describes the punishment for soldiers caught in sexual acts: public beating and expulsion from the legion. The punishment existed because the crime was happening. If soldiers never had sex with each other, there would be no need for specific penalties. But here is what the military did allow. Soldiers could use local prostitutes, male or female, when they were stationed near towns. They could take captives as sexual slaves after conquests. They could keep enslaved boys as personal servants, and those boys were absolutely used sexually. The prohibition was only against sex between fellow soldiers, between equals in the military hierarchy. Sex with slaves, foreigners, prostitutes, that was fine. That maintained the power structure. A Roman soldier penetrating a conquered German boy was performing Roman dominance. A Roman soldier penetrating another Roman soldier was breaking the chain of command. And the camps had enslaved attendants everywhere. Boys who cooked, cleaned, tended horses, hauled water, and yes, provided sexual services to the soldiers who owned them. These boys were called colons. camp slaves. They lived alongside the legions, following them on campaign, doing the daily labor that kept the army functioning. And they were vulnerable. Completely. A soldier could use his kalos sexually whenever he wanted. It was expected. Some soldiers formed long-term relationships with their colones, keeping the same boy for years, treating him almost like a spouse. But the boy was still enslaved, still property, still had no choice. We find traces of these relationships in military records. Wills written by soldiers sometimes mention their colones by name, leaving them money or freedom after the soldier's death. Epitaphs on military tombstones occasionally include dedications from freedmen who had served specific soldiers, suggesting lasting bonds that extended beyond pure exploitation. One tombstone from Roman Britain reads, "To Marcus Aurelius Nepos, soldier of the 20th Legion, aged 35, served 20 years. His freedman Saturninus set this up." Why would a freedman pay for an elaborate tombstone for his former master, unless there had been real affection between them, or at least obligation, or trauma bonding? The emotions involved were probably complicated. But some of those complications were real love. They had to be. Human beings in proximity, in isolation, under stress, form attachments. Even when those attachments begin in violence and coercion, they can evolve into something that feels like love to the people involved. A soldier and his kalo might spend a decade together, survive battles together. The soldier might teach the boy Latin, train him to fight, eventually free him and take him as a companion rather than a slave. The power imbalance never fully disappeared, but the relationship could become something more than rape, something neither of them had words for: partnership, devotion, survival. And then there were the officers, centurions, tribunes, legates, men with private quarters and privacy, and the ability to maintain more discreet relationships. Officers could afford higher quality slaves, could keep multiple attendants, could visit prostitutes in town without the enlisted men knowing, and officers absolutely had male lovers. We know because they show up in letters, in wills, in legal disputes over inheritances. One famous case from the reign of Hadrian involves a military tribune who left his entire estate to a young freedman who had served him for 15 years. The man's biological family contested the will, arguing that the freedman had used sexual influence to manipulate their relative. The case went to the emperor. Hadrian sided with the freedman. The will stood. What does that tell us? That these relationships were common enough to have established legal precedent, that the Roman state recognized them, even when families objected, that a man could love another man enough to give him everything, and the empire would uphold that decision. But what about the soldiers themselves? The ordinary men in the ranks? Did they fall in love with each other despite the prohibition? Yes. They must have. The human heart does not obey military regulations. You cannot put thousands of young men together in life or death situations and expect zero romantic or sexual attachment. It happened. The question is how they managed it. The answer is, very carefully, secretly. Men who wanted each other found ways. Late at night when the rest of the tent was asleep. Off-duty hours in the bathhouses. The woods outside camp during patrols. They took enormous risks because the desire was stronger than the fear of punishment. And we have one piece of direct evidence. A letter found in a Roman military fort in Britain called Vindolanda. The Vindolanda tablets are thin wooden sheets that Roman soldiers used for correspondence, and they survived in the wet British soil for 2,000 years. Most of them are mundane. Requests for supplies, birthday party invitations, lists of provisions. But one tablet, labelled Tablet 291, is different. It is a letter from one soldier to another, and the tone is unmistakably intimate. The soldier writes, "I have sent you pairs of socks, 2 pairs of sandals, and 2 pairs of underpants. Greet Elpis, Tetricus, and all your messmates, with whom I pray that you live in the greatest good fortune." Standard so far. But then the final line. It is my wish that you enjoy the best of health and good fortune, my dearest brother, my heart's desire, my sweetest soul. Frater carissim, dearest brother, anima mea, my soul. These were terms of deep endearment, possibly romantic, possibly just the heightened emotional language of military brotherhood. We will never know for certain what the relationship between these two men was, but the language is passionate, tender, intimate in a way that transcends casual friendship. And the letter was sent. The writer was not afraid to express these feelings, at least in private correspondence. That gives us a window. Roman soldiers loved each other. Maybe not sexually in most cases. The prohibition and the surveillance were too strong. But emotionally, intensely, they formed bonds that modern people might call romantic, even if no sex was involved. The line between passionate friendship and romantic love is always blurry, especially in all-male environments where traditional romance is forbidden. The Roman military lived in that blur. Brothers in arms, soulmates, lovers who never touched, all of the above. And when soldiers retired, after 20 or 25 years of service, they often settled together, bought land together, built households together. Roman law did not recognize these partnerships, but the men lived them anyway. We find joint tombstones, shared graves, two veteran soldiers buried side by side with inscriptions calling each other most faithful companion or brother in all things. Were they lovers? Were they just friends? Does it matter? They chose each other, built lives together. That was a form of love Rome allowed, as long as you did not call it what it was. The gladiators had their own culture, even more violent, even more homoerotic, even more complicated. Gladiators were mostly enslaved men or criminals condemned to die in the arena. They lived in ludi, gladiator schools, locked barracks where they trained and waited for their fights. All male. Brutal hierarchy. The strongest fighters got the best food, the most attention, the glory. The weak died. And in that pressure cooker of violence and masculinity, sexual relationships absolutely happened. Gladiators were sex symbols. The Roman public was obsessed with them. Graffiti in Pompeii calls one gladiator the heartthrob of the girls. Another piece reads, Celadus the Thracian makes the girls moan. But the girls were not the only ones interested. Men were obsessed too. Wealthy Roman men attended the games religiously, watched specific fighters, learned their names and fighting styles, and sometimes paid enormous sums to spend a night with a famous gladiator. Yes, you could rent a gladiator for sex. They were enslaved. Their owners prostituted them. A successful gladiator could command high prices, not just for appearances, but for private encounters. And what happened in those encounters? The wealthy Roman paying for the gladiator almost certainly expected to take the active role. The gladiator, despite being this symbol of hypermasculinity in the arena, was still enslaved and therefore expected to submit. The contradiction must have been psychologically devastating. You are the most masculine man in Rome when you are fighting. You're a piece of meat when you are in someone's bed. The same men who cheered for you in the arena paid to penetrate you at night. But inside the gladiator barracks, among themselves, the power dynamics were different. Gladiators formed intense bonds with each other, training partners, tent mates, men who shared the knowledge that they would probably die young and violently. That intimacy bred relationships. Some fighters paired off, becoming inseparable, protecting each other, sharing everything. The lanista, the gladiator trainer, sometimes encouraged these pairings because fighters who cared about each other trained harder and put on better shows. We have accounts of gladiators refusing to fight each other, throwing down their weapons when matched against their partners. The crowds hated this. They wanted blood. But the fighters chose each other over the spectacle. Some died for that choice. executed for refusing to perform, and their deaths were recorded as shameful, cowardly, but read it differently. They were love stories, tragedies, two men who would rather die than kill the person they loved. The most famous gladiator in Roman history was Spartacus, led a massive slave revolt in 73 BCE. 70,000 escaped slaves following him, defeating Roman legions, terrorizing Italy for 2 years. And Spartacus had a wife. The ancient sources mention her, a prophetess from his home region of Thrace. But Spartacus also had a close companion, a fellow gladiator who fought beside him throughout the revolt. The sources do not name him. They just note that one gladiator was always at Spartacus's side, shared his tent, fought in the front ranks with him. Were they lovers? We do not know. But they were bonded in a way that transcended ordinary friendship. And when the revolt was finally crushed, and 6,000 rebels were crucified along the Appian Way, that unnamed gladiator probably died on a cross within sight of Spartacus, together to the end. Crucifixion brings us to punishment, because Rome did punish certain forms of gay sex. Not all, not even most, but specific violations. If you raped a freeborn Roman boy, you could be executed. Not for the gay sex, for violating a citizen's bodily integrity. The boy's family could prosecute you under assault laws. You had damaged their property, their son, their honor. The punishment was severe because you had crossed a sacred boundary. Freeborn citizens' bodies were protected. You could not just take them the way you could take a slave. This law, the lex scantinia, was rarely enforced, but it existed. It meant that a father could theoretically defend his son from sexual predators, at least in theory, at least if the father had money for lawyers and political connections. In practice, most violations went unpunished. Boys were assaulted constantly, but occasionally, when a particularly egregious case became public, when the victim's family had enough power to demand justice, Rome pretended to care. A trial would happen. Witnesses would testify. And if the rapist was convicted, the penalty could be death or exile or massive fines. The point was not protecting children. The point was maintaining the social order, protecting the property rights of citizen families. If you were a Roman citizen and you worked as a prostitute, you lost your citizenship rights permanently. This was not a criminal penalty. This was civil death. You could no longer vote, hold office, or testify in court except under torture. You were marked, stained, and the stain never washed off. Even if you stopped prostituting yourself, even if you became wealthy later through other means, you were legally infamous, disgraced, forever. This law applied to both male and female prostitutes, but it hit male prostitutes harder because they were already men, already supposed to be dominant and active. Selling their bodies, submitting to penetration for money, was the ultimate betrayal of Roman masculinity. They became non-persons, and if you were caught in the act of sex with another man, and your political enemies wanted to destroy you, they could use it. Sexual scandal was a weapon. We see this throughout Roman political history. Accusations of sexual passivity ruined careers. Mark Antony's enemies spread rumors that he had prostituted himself as a young man. Julius Caesar's enemies never let him forget the Queen of Bithynia rumor. The Emperor Elagabalus was murdered partly because of his sexual passivity. These accusations did not need to be true. They just needed to be believable. And once the rumor spread, once enough people repeated it, the damage was done. Your reputation was destroyed. Your masculinity was questioned. Your political power evaporated. So gay sex existed in this strange zone, everywhere and nowhere, openly practiced and simultaneously deniable. As long as no one talked about it directly, as long as you maintained the proper role, as long as you did not become a public scandal, you were fine. But the moment it became public, the moment someone decided to weaponize it against you, you were vulnerable. Completely. This is what Rome really did. It created a system where gay desire was simultaneously normalized and stigmatized, accepted and punishable, visible and invisible. It all depended on context, on power, on who you were and who you were with and who was watching. The poets understood this better than anyone. They lived in the contradiction. They wrote homoerotic verses and published them and faced no consequences. But they also knew the limits. They knew how to code their language, how to praise a boy's beauty without explicitly describing the sex act, how to hint and suggest and imply without crossing into dangerous territory. Horace, one of the greatest Roman poets, wrote openly about his attraction to boys. In one poem, he describes seeing a beautiful slave boy at a dinner party and being so overwhelmed with desire that he could barely speak. In another poem, he talks about chasing after a boy named Ligurianus who keeps rejecting him. The poems are funny, self-deprecating. Horace presents himself as a middle-aged man making a fool of himself over unattainable youth. But he is also describing gay desire, directly. And these poems were bestsellers. Everyone read them. No one cared. But Horace was also careful. He never described himself being penetrated. He never admitted to passivity. He maintained the fiction of being the pursuer, the dominant one, even when the boys rejected him. That kept him safe, that kept his reputation intact. Ovid was less careful, and Ovid paid for it. Ovid was Rome's most popular poet in the late 1st century BCE. His work was everywhere. Metamorphoses, the art of love, erotic poetry, mythological epics. He was a celebrity. And then in 8 CE, the Emperor Augustus suddenly exiled him to a miserable town on the edge of the empire called Tomis, on the Black Sea coast. Ovid spent the last decade of his life there, writing desperate poems begging to be allowed to return to Rome. He died in exile. He never came back. Why was he exiled? Ovid himself said it was because of a poem and a mistake. The poem was The Art of Love, which was too sexually explicit and offended Augustus's new morality laws. But the mistake, Ovid never specified. Historians have speculated for 2,000 years. Some think he witnessed something involving Augustus's family, some sexual scandal he was not supposed to see. Some think he was having an affair with Augustus's granddaughter, and some think the mistake was a sexual relationship with a man of the imperial family, or another high-ranking person that became too public, too scandalous to ignore. We will never know. Ovid took the secret to his grave, but his fate shows the danger. You could write about gay desire, you could practice it privately, but if you crossed the wrong person, if you became inconvenient or scandalous at the wrong moment, the emperor could destroy you, exile you, erase you from public life, and no one would even tell you exactly why. That was the constant threat, the sword hanging over every Roman who lived outside the sexual mainstream. You were tolerated until you were not. You were safe until someone decided you were not. There were no guaranteed rights, no protections, just the whims of whoever had power over you. And for the Christians, those whims became deadly. Early Christians were a tiny persecuted minority in the 1st and 2nd centuries CE. They refused to worship the emperor. They refused to participate in Roman civic religion. They met in secret. They practiced a totally foreign moral system, and Romans hated them for it. Christians were arrested, tortured, thrown to wild animals in the arena, crucified, burned alive. Tens of thousands died. The persecutions were sporadic but brutal. And one of the things Romans accused Christians of was sexual deviance, incest, orgies, strange secret rituals. These accusations were mostly invented. Christians were actually practicing strict sexual morality, the opposite of Roman permissiveness. But Romans did not understand that. They saw a cult that refused normal social bonds, refused normal marriage patterns, called each other brother and sister, shared communal meals, and kissed each other in greeting. It looked suspicious. It looked deviant. So the rumors spread. Christians were doing weird sex stuff, unnatural stuff. But here is the twist. Some early Christian communities probably did include gay people, people fleeing Roman sexual culture, people who had been enslaved and abused and found refuge in a religion that said all people were equal before God. that your body was a temple, that sex outside of marriage was wrong for everyone, not just the powerless. Christianity offered something Rome did not: the idea that you could say no, that your body belonged to you or to God, but not to your master, not to whoever wanted to use you. For a slave who had been raped for years, that message was revolutionary. You are not property. You are a child of God. Your abuser will face judgment. That was hope. That was dignity. And some early Christians were absolutely former prostitutes, former slaves, people escaping sexual exploitation. The religion gave them a new identity, a new community, a reason to refuse. But early Christianity was also developing its own sexual rules, and those rules were harsh. The Apostle Paul wrote letters condemning same-sex activity. In his letter to the Romans, he describes men who abandoned natural relations with women and were consumed with passion for one another. He calls this shameful, degrading, a punishment from God. In his first letter to the Corinthians, he lists men who have sex with men among those who will not inherit the kingdom of God, right alongside thieves and adulterers. This was new language. Romans had categories: active, passive, citizen, slave. Paul had a different category: sexual sin. All gay sex was sinful, not because of the roles involved, because it was same-sex. Period. This idea that the gender of your partner mattered morally was barely present in Roman thought. It was central to Christian thought. And as Christianity grew, as it moved from persecuted cult to state religion, that idea spread. But in the first 3 centuries, Christians were the ones being persecuted, not the persecutors. Gay Romans had nothing to fear from Christians. They had everything to fear from other Romans, from emperors who could exile them on a whim, from enemies who could weaponize sexual rumors, from the constant possibility of falling from the active role to the passive role and losing everything. That fear shaped everything. It made Roman gay life simultaneously open and paranoid. You could love men. You could sleep with men. You could write about it. But you could never fully relax, never fully trust that your position was secure. Because Roman society was always watching, always judging, always ready to punish anyone who stepped out of line. And the line was arbitrary, enforced inconsistently, dependent on politics and personal vendettas and the mood of whoever had power at the moment. That is what Rome really did to gay men. It gave them freedom within rigid constraints. It allowed desire but punished vulnerability. It celebrated masculine love while destroying anyone who loved too passively, too obviously, too equally. The system was designed to maintain hierarchy, always. Same-sex desire was allowed because it could be folded into existing power structures: masters and slaves, patrons and clients, older men and younger men, soldiers and captives, citizens and foreigners. As long as the sex reinforced who was dominant and who was submissive, Rome did not care. The moment it threatened to create equality, to blur the lines, to suggest that a passive partner could be respected, or that 2 men of equal status could love each other as equals, the system cracked down. That is the hidden truth. Rome was not a paradise. Rome was not progressive. Rome was pragmatic. It allowed gay sex because banning it would have been impossible and pointless. Desire exists. Men want other men. Rome knew this, so Rome channeled that desire into acceptable forms, controlled it, structured it, exploited it, and anyone who tried to love outside the structure paid the price. The price was always paid by the same people: the enslaved, the poor, the young, the powerless. For every poem Catullus wrote about kissing Juventius, there were a dozen boys like Juventius who never got to write their own stories. For every emperor who deified his dead lover, there were thousands of slaves who were used and discarded without anyone bothering to carve their names on tombstones. The historical record is brutally unbalanced. We have the voices of the powerful men who desired. We almost never have the voices of the desired. But sometimes, rarely, a crack appears in the wall. a glimpse through. In the Egyptian desert, archaeologists found thousands of papyri preserved in the dry sand. Letters, receipts, contracts, the mundane documentation of daily life in the Roman provinces. And buried among the grain shipment records and tax receipts, we find personal letters. One, dated to the 2nd century CE, is from a young man named Antonius to someone he calls "my sweetest lord." The letter is damaged, fragmentary, but what survives is striking. Antonius writes about missing this person desperately, about waiting for him to return from a journey, about the pain of separation. The language is intimate, devoted. "I cannot sleep when you are gone," he writes. "My whole soul waits for you." Was this romantic, sexual? We cannot know for certain, but the intensity is undeniable. And Antonius was not a famous poet. He was probably not wealthy. His Greek is rough, his spelling inconsistent. This was just an ordinary person in Roman Egypt, loving someone and writing it down because the feeling was too large to contain. The letter survived 2,000 years in the sand. Antonius did not know anyone would ever read it. He was just writing to someone he missed, someone he loved. And now we have this tiny window into a life the official histories ignored. There are other papyri like this, scattered fragments. A letter from one soldier to another. "I saw your brother, and it made my heart ache with missing you." A contract between two men establishing a shared household and pooled resources, with language that legal historians think suggests a domestic partnership. A receipt for a joint burial plot, purchased by Marcus and Silvanus, companions in life and death. These scraps survive by accident. They were never meant to be historical documents. They were just people living their lives, loving who they loved, making arrangements for the future. And those arrangements sometimes involved other men. The word companion shows up over and over, concubinalis in Latin. It literally means tent mate, someone you share close quarters with, but it carried emotional weight. When a tombstone said two men were companions, everyone understood that meant something beyond casual friendship, inseparable, bonded. Partners in some sense the culture did not have precise language for. We see this especially with freedmen, two former slaves who gained their freedom and then immediately set up a household together, living as companions for 30 or 40 years until one died and the other paid for a joint tomb. The arrangements were domestic, permanent, recognized by the community even if not by law. One tombstone from Roman Gaul, now in modern France, shows two men in relief sculpture, standing side by side, dressed identically, their hands clasped. The inscription reads, "To Lucius Antistius Sarculo and Antistius Campanus, freedmen, companions of 42 years, this monument was erected by their joint heirs." 42 years. They lived together for 42 years. They were important enough that they had joint heirs, probably adopted sons or freed slaves they had trained. They commissioned this tombstone together before they died, planning to be buried together, memorialized together. And the sculptor showed them holding hands. That image is radical. Physical affection between men in Roman art was usually constrained to specific contexts. Battle scenes, mythological subjects, the emperor and his favorites. But here, two ordinary freedmen declaring their bond in stone, hands clasped, equal in death, the tombstone still exists. You can see it in a museum in Lyon. Two men, 2,000 years dead, still holding hands. How many more relationships like this existed but left no trace? How many pairs of men who loved each other, lived together, died together, but were too poor for tombstones or too cautious to declare it publicly? The vast majority of Roman lives are completely lost to history. We have fragmentary evidence for maybe 1% of the people who lived in the empire. Everyone else is silence. And in that silence, there must have been thousands of love stories, tragedies, quiet lives of devotion, all erased. The erasure was sometimes intentional. When powerful men had relationships with other men, their families often tried to hide the evidence after death. Wills were contested, letters were destroyed, tombstone inscriptions were altered. If a senator left his fortune to his male lover, the senator's children would sue, arguing the will was invalid because it was made under undue influence, or while the senator was mentally incompetent. They would drag the lover's character through the courts, calling him a prostitute, a social climber, a predatory gold digger. Sometimes they won. The will was overturned, the lover got nothing, and the family made sure to bury the senator with full honors, emphasizing his legitimate marriage, his children, erasing any mention of the man he had actually shared his life with. This happened to the younger Pliny's friend, a man named Domitius Tullus. Tullus was a wealthy senator who never married. He lived with a younger man, a freedman named Nomius. When Tullus died around 108 CE, he left everything to Nomius. Tullus's extended family immediately sued. The case went on for years. Pliny mentions it in his letters, expressing sympathy for Nomius, saying Tullus had genuinely loved him and the family was just being greedy. But we do not know how the case ended. Nomius disappears from the record. Either he lost and was left destitute, or he won and decided to live quietly to avoid further attacks. Either way, history forgot him. We only know his name because Pliny happened to mention him in passing. How many men like Nomius existed? How many loved and lost and left no trace? The provinces complicate the picture further. Rome was an empire, not just a city. It controlled territory from Britain to Syria, from Spain to Egypt. And each region had its own pre-Roman sexual culture that interacted with Roman norms in complicated ways. In Greece, pederasty was still practiced the old way, with formal courtship rituals between older men and adolescent boys. The Greeks under Roman rule maintained their philosophical traditions about the educative value of these relationships, even as Rome turned the practice into simple exploitation. Greek aristocrats still wrote about the noble love between men, while Romans just wanted the pretty boys. In Egypt, Greek and Roman settlers encountered ancient Egyptian sexual norms that were different from both. Egyptian religion had gods who changed gender. Egyptian mythology included same-sex desire among the gods. The Romans who settled in Egypt sometimes adopted local customs, sometimes imposed their own, often created a hybrid culture. We find evidence of this in the papyri. Marriage contracts that do not quite fit Roman templates. Religious dedications that blend Egyptian and Roman deities in ways that suggest blended sexual identities. It is messy. History is messy. In the Celtic regions, Gaul and Britain, we have almost no direct evidence of indigenous same-sex practices because the Celts did not write extensively, and the Romans who wrote about them were unreliable. Roman authors described Celts as barbaric, savage, sexually promiscuous. They claimed Celtic men slept with each other openly, that Celtic warriors had male lovers they brought to battle. How much of this was true and how much was Roman propaganda designed to make the Celts seem uncivilized? We cannot know. But Roman soldiers stationed in Britain absolutely had sexual relationships with local men, both enslaved and free. The Vindolanda tablets prove Romans were writing love letters to each other on the edge of the empire. And genetic evidence shows extensive mixing between Roman soldiers and local populations. Some of that mixing was heterosexual, some was not. In the eastern provinces, Syria and Judea, Roman sexual culture crashed into Jewish and early Christian sexual morality. Jewish law, derived from the Torah, explicitly forbade male same-sex intercourse. Leviticus called it an abomination. Jewish communities under Roman rule maintained this prohibition even as they were surrounded by Roman sexual permissiveness. This created tension. Roman governors in Judea had to navigate between Roman norms and local religious law. They generally did not care what Jews did among themselves, but they also were not going to stop being Roman just because the locals objected. And this is where the cultural clash becomes violent. The Jewish revolts against Rome in 66-70 CE and 132-133 135 CE, were partly about religious freedom. Jews were fighting for the right to maintain their own laws and customs against Roman cultural imperialism. And one of those customs was sexual morality. Romans saw Jewish sexual restrictions as bizarre and prudish. Jews saw Roman sexual behavior as sinful and corrupt. When the Romans destroyed the Second Temple in 70 CE, when they renamed Judea to Syria Palestina and tried to erase Jewish identity, they were also trying to impose Roman cultural norms, including Roman sexual norms, on a population that fundamentally rejected them. The early Christian movement grew out of this context: Jewish sexual morality plus a new theology of radical equality before God. And as Christianity spread through the empire, it carried that sexual morality with it. Into Rome itself, into the households of the wealthy, into the slave quarters. Some slaves converted to Christianity because it told them their bodies were sacred, that sexual exploitation was sin, that their masters would face divine judgment. This was subversive, dangerous, and Rome initially responded with persecution. But not all persecution was about sex. Most of it was about politics and religion, and refusal to worship the emperor. The sexual dimension was mostly Roman propaganda. Romans accused Christians of sexual deviance to discredit them. The accusations were projection. Romans could not imagine a community of men and women living together without Roman-style sexual exploitation, so they assumed Christians must be doing something perverse in secret. In reality, early Christian communities were developing strict sexual codes. No sex outside of heterosexual marriage. No divorce except for adultery. No prostitution. No sleeping with slaves. And definitely no same-sex relations. The Apostle Paul was clear on this. The early church fathers built on Paul's teachings, developing increasingly detailed prohibitions. By the 3rd century, Christian writers were producing whole treatises condemning same-sex desire as demonic, unnatural, a corruption of God's design. But the Christians were still a minority, still persecuted. Their sexual rules only applied within their own communities. The broader Roman culture continued exactly as before. The bathhouses stayed open. The slave boys were still available. The poets still wrote homoerotic verses. Christianity was a strange cult with weird ideas about sex. Nothing more. That changed in 312 CE when Constantine converted, and it changed slowly even then. Constantine did not immediately ban gay sex or close the bathhouses or free all the slave boys. He fought civil wars, consolidated power, moved the capital to Constantinople, and gradually began to favor Christian bishops and Christian morality. But the empire was massive. Change took generations. The real shift came in the late 4th century. In 390 CE, the Emperor Theodosius issued the law threatening men who play the role of a woman with death by burning. This was the first time an emperor explicitly criminalized passive gay sex empire-wide. Not just shameful, criminal, punishable by execution. The law was probably not widely enforced. Enforcement of any Roman law outside major cities was sporadic at best. But its existence marked a turning point. The state was now officially opposed to gay sex. Christian morality was becoming state policy. And Theodosius went further. He began closing pagan temples, banning pagan festivals, ending state support for the old religions. Christianity was becoming the only acceptable religion, and Christian sexual morality was becoming the only acceptable sexual morality. The cultural transformation was underway. By the 6th century, under the Emperor Justinian, it was complete. Justinian's legal code, the Corpus Juris Civilis, explicitly criminalized all male same-sex activity. The penalty was castration, torture, and death. Justinian justified this by claiming that gay sex caused natural disasters, earthquakes, plagues, famines. God was punishing the empire for tolerating sexual sin. Therefore, the sin must be eliminated. root it out, punish it brutally, save the empire by enforcing divine law. This was a total reversal. 1,000 years of Roman sexual culture, gone, replaced by Christian sexual regulation. And it happened within 3 centuries, from Constantine's conversion to Justinian's code. 300 years to erase a millennium. But the erasure was never complete. Laws exist on paper. Life continues in the streets. Even under Justinian, even with the death penalty in place, men still loved men. They just hid it better. The bathhouses gradually closed, but private homes had their own bathing rooms. Slavery continued, and masters still used their slaves sexually. Prostitution continued in underground markets. Human desire does not vanish because a law says it should. It just goes underground, and underground is where it stayed for the next 1,000 years. The Middle Ages inherited Christian Rome's sexual prohibitions and built on them. The medieval church developed extensive theology condemning sodomy, defining it as the worst possible sin, prescribing brutal penalties. The cultural memory of Roman sexual openness was almost completely lost. Medieval Europeans read Roman poetry and convinced themselves it could not possibly mean what it obviously meant. They invented elaborate allegories to explain away the homoerotic content. They censored, they misinterpreted deliberately, they erased. And that erasure lasted until the Renaissance, when scholars started reading Roman texts carefully again and going, wait, what exactly was Catullus doing with Juventus? The shock of rediscovery. The realization that the classical civilization they had been taught to admire was incredibly, openly, casually gay. That knowledge disrupted European culture for centuries. It still does. But here is what gets lost in that story of rise and fall. Acceptance and prohibition. Pagan Rome versus Christian Rome. The people. The actual men who lived through this. The slave boy who was raped by his master in 150 CE, when it was completely legal, and then again in 450 CE, when it was a capital crime. Did the law change his experience? No. He was still enslaved, still raped. The only difference was that in 450 CE, his master might have felt slightly more anxious about getting caught, might have been slightly more discreet, but the rape still happened. The law did not save him. The freedman who lived with his companion for 40 years, who planned a joint tomb, who held hands in the relief sculpture. If he lived in 100 CE, he could do that openly. If he lived in 500 CE, he had to hide it, claim they were brothers, downplay the relationship in public, but they still loved each other, still lived together, still planned to be buried together. The law made their lives harder. It did not make their love disappear. The soldier who wrote love letters to his tent mate. In 200 CE, dangerous but possible. In 400 CE, deadly if discovered. But the letters were still written, just burned immediately after reading instead of preserved. The feelings were the same. The risk was higher. That was the only difference. What Rome really did to gay men was create a structure where same-sex desire existed in constant negotiation with power. When Rome was pagan, the negotiation was about social hierarchy, active versus passive, citizen versus slave. As long as you maintained the proper power dynamic, you were safe. When Rome became Christian, the negotiation was about secrecy, public conformity versus private truth. As long as no one found out, you survived. But in both systems, gay men existed, loved, survived, built lives. The structure changed, the penalties changed, the level of danger changed. But the fundamental reality that men desire other men and find ways to act on that desire never changed. Rome did not create gay men. Rome did not destroy gay men. Rome was just one particular set of rules that gay men had to navigate to survive. And some navigated it successfully. The wealthy man who kept beautiful slave boys and wrote poetry about them and died honored and respected. He won the game. He got to live his desire openly within the boundaries the culture allowed. His name survives. His poems are in museums. Some navigated it unsuccessfully. The senator accused of sexual passivity, real or invented, whose career was destroyed by rumor. The prostitute, who lost his citizenship forever after one transaction. The slave castrated to preserve his boyish beauty, and then discarded when he aged out of desirability. They lost. The system destroyed them. Most of them, we do not even know their names. And most were somewhere in between. The soldiers who loved each other quietly. The freedmen who built households together. The ordinary people in the provinces writing letters about missing someone, wanting someone, loving someone. They navigated the system carefully, took what happiness they could find, survived. Their lives were not tragic and were not triumphant. They were just lives, gay lives in Rome, as complicated and contradictory as the empire itself. The bathhouse attendant who was raped daily but also fell in love with another attendant, and they planned an escape together, saved money for years, bought their freedom, and then what? We do not know. The record ends. But for a moment, they had hope. They had each other. That was something. The gladiator who was a sex symbol to thousands but loved one specific person, another fighter, and they died together rather than fight each other. Romantic or tragic or both. We do not get to decide. They did not leave us their interpretation, just the story that they refused. The emperor's boyfriend, deified after death, immortalized in thousands of statues. Was he happy? Did he love Hadrian back, or was he just surviving the attentions of the most powerful man alive? Did he drown accidentally, or did he kill himself to escape? The ancient sources disagree. Modern historians argue. Antinous cannot answer. He is marble now, beautiful and silent forever. That is what Rome really did. It gave us fragments, poems and laws and graffiti and tombstones and papyrus scraps and statues, pieces of lives, glimpses of a sexual culture so different from our own that we struggle to understand it. We want Rome to be either a gay paradise or a nightmare of oppression. It was neither. It was both. It was a complex system where some gay men thrived and some were destroyed and most just lived, navigating between the two extremes. And the question we keep asking is, what does this mean for us? What do we do with Rome's legacy? How do we tell this story honestly? We acknowledge the contradictions. We do not sanitize the exploitation to make Rome look progressive. We do not ignore the genuine affection to make Rome look purely evil. We hold both truths. Roman men loved other men. Roman culture enabled horrific sexual violence. Both true, simultaneously. We look at the evidence and we see patterns that repeat across centuries. The same dynamics appearing in different contexts. The powerful taking from the powerless. The young being consumed by the old. The enslaved being used and discarded. But also love appearing in unexpected places. Devotion lasting decades. Men choosing each other over safety, over life itself sometimes. The pattern that appears most consistently is this. Roman culture treated male beauty as a commodity, youth as something to be purchased and consumed, and the younger you were, the higher your value, until you aged out of desirability completely. This created a brutal timeline for boys and young men trapped in the system. Let me walk you through the life cycle. A boy born into slavery in Rome, or captured in a military campaign and brought back as a child, entered the sexual marketplace around age 11 or 12. Puberty. The moment his body became interesting to adult men. If he was beautiful, if he had the features Romans prized, smooth skin, delicate face, dark eyes, he was valuable. His owner could sell him for enormous sums, or keep him for personal use, or rent him out to wealthy clients. The boy had no say. For the next 5 to 8 years, roughly ages 12 to 19, he was at peak value. This was when Roman men wanted him most, before his beard came in, before his voice deepened fully, before he developed adult male musculature. The Romans wanted him to look as unlike an adult man as possible while still being male, adolescent, ambiguous, penetrable without completely violating the gender order. A boy was not yet a man, so sex with him did not carry the same stigma as sex with an adult male citizen. He existed in a liminal category, male but not masculine, a body that could be desired without shame. During these years, if the boy was enslaved in a wealthy household, his life was probably a nightmare. Available to the master at any time, potentially also available to the master's friends, loaned out for dinner parties, displayed as a status symbol. The sources describe this casually. Seneca mentions a dinner where the host brought out his beautiful boys to serve wine and entertain the guests. Martial jokes about a man who is so obsessed with his own slave boy that he refuses to let anyone else touch him, as if this possessiveness was the unusual part, not the ownership itself. Some boys in this situation tried to make themselves useful in other ways, learned to read and write, became secretaries or accountants, developed skills that would keep them valuable after their sexual appeal faded. This was survival strategy. If you were just a pretty face, you had maybe 7 years before you were replaced by a younger boy. If you were pretty and competent, you might last longer, might earn your freedom eventually, might survive. Other boys were locked into the sexual role exclusively, kept deliberately uneducated, fed well to maintain their looks but given no training, no skills, nothing but their bodies. These boys had no future. When they aged out, when the beard came in and the voice dropped, and the soft adolescent look hardened into adult masculinity, they became worthless. Their owners sold them to brothels or to manual labor, or simply turned them out on the street. A 15-year-old boy purchased for a fortune became a 20-year-old man worth almost nothing. The same person, just older. That was enough. The brothels took the aging out boys and put them to work in the cheapest rooms, servicing clients who could not afford younger flesh. The prices dropped with every year of age. A 12-year-old boy in a high-end establishment might cost a gold coin. A 20-year-old in a street-side brothel charged a few copper asses. Same service, different value, entirely dependent on how closely they still resembled children. This is deeply disturbing, but we have to look at it clearly. The Roman sexual economy placed maximum value on youth and devalued adult male beauty almost completely. The poets confirm this. Martial has multiple poems mocking older men who still try to attract male lovers. He describes one man dyeing his grey hair black and plucking out white beard hairs and desperately trying to maintain a youthful appearance. Martial calls him pathetic, ridiculous. "You are old," he says. "Give up. No one wants you anymore." The cruelty is breathtaking, but it reveals the system. Male sexual attractiveness in Roman culture had an expiration date. Mid-20s at the absolute latest. After that, you were supposed to transition from being desired to being the desirer, from passive to active, from object to subject. If you were wealthy and free, this transition gave you power. Now you were the one purchasing the boys, the one writing the poems, the one in control. But if you were enslaved or poor, aging out of desirability just meant you lost your only asset. You became invisible. And some men never made the transition, never stopped wanting to be desired, never stopped seeking male attention in the passive role. These men were Rome's greatest source of anxiety and mockery. The pathicus, the habitual passive partner, the adult man who wanted to be penetrated. Roman culture had no category for him except disgust. The medical writers treated pathicy as diseased, corrupted. There was a persistent Roman belief that being penetrated too much, especially from a young age, physically damaged you, made you weak, effeminate, changed your walk, your voice, your entire bearing. The physician Celsus, writing in the 1st century CE, describes those who have been used sexually from youth as having loose anal muscles, soft bodies, high voices. He treats this as medical fact, the result of physical trauma combined with moral corruption. Whether any of this was medically accurate is irrelevant. The point is that Romans believed it. They believed that passivity left marks on your body, that you could identify a pathicus by looking at him, by the way he moved, the way he spoke. And once identified, he was subject to total social contempt, even lower than prostitutes, because at least prostitutes were doing it for money, for survival. The pathicus was doing it because he wanted to, because he desired his own subordination. That was incomprehensible, unforgivable. Juvenal, the satirist, wrote an entire poem in the late 1st century CE mocking elite Roman men who took the passive role. He describes a secret gathering where powerful men dress in women's clothing, wear makeup, and compete for male attention. Juvenal presents this as the height of degeneracy, the collapse of Roman masculinity. He names real people, powerful senators and knights, and accuses them of this behavior. Whether the accusations were true does not matter. The poem functioned as threat. This is what will happen to your reputation if anyone suspects you of passivity. Total destruction. But the poem also proves these men existed. Juvenal would not bother satirizing something completely imaginary. Somewhere in Rome, probably in multiple places, there were elite men who gathered in private to express desires the public world forbade. Men who wanted to be desired, to be penetrated, to occupy the feminine role sexually. They had to hide, meet in secret, trust absolutely no one outside their circle, because discovery meant ruin. We have one account of such a gathering being raided. During the reign of Domitian, around 90 CE, the Praetorian Guards supposedly broke up a party where senators were found in women's clothing engaged in sexual acts with each other and with slave boys. Some of the men were executed. Others were exiled. The story might be exaggerated or even invented. It appears in hostile sources written after Domitian's assassination. But again, the fact that Romans found this plausible tells us something. Secret gay gatherings happened. The powerful participated, and when they were caught, the consequences were deadly. So most stayed hidden, lived double lives, maintained respectable public personas, married, had children, performed Roman masculinity during the day, and then at night, in locked rooms with trusted partners, they became someone else, expressed desires they could never acknowledge in daylight. This created enormous psychological pressure. The constant performance, the fear of discovery, the knowledge that your entire life could collapse if the wrong person found out. And sometimes it did collapse. Sometimes a slave talked. A disgruntled ex-lover spread rumors. A political enemy discovered evidence, and then the full weight of Roman social machinery came down. Prosecution under sexual morality laws, public humiliation, loss of citizenship rights, exile, in extreme cases, execution. The punishment was designed to be spectacular, to make an example, to terrify anyone else considering similar behavior. But here is what is crucial. The punishment was almost always for men of status, citizens, the elite. When the powerful were discovered in passive roles, Rome reacted with fury because they had betrayed their class position. They had made themselves like slaves, like women. They had degraded their status. That was the crime. Meanwhile, actual slaves, actual prostitutes, men who took the passive role daily as part of their survival, faced no additional legal penalty because they were already at the bottom, already degraded. They had nothing more to lose. This created a strange inverted privilege. The enslaved pathicus was pitied or mocked, but not legally punished. The free citizen pathicus was destroyed. The system protected the hierarchy more than it protected any particular sexual norm. A slave being penetrated was expected. A senator being penetrated was intolerable. Same act, different consequences, entirely dependent on social status. And this status obsession meant that even the language Romans used for gay sex was stratified, different words for different social contexts. Pedicare meant to penetrate anally. Using this word about yourself was fine if you were the active partner. Irumare meant to force oral sex, specifically to penetrate someone's mouth. Again, fine if you were the active partner, but severe meant to be penetrated. Passive. And this word was an insult. You did not use it about yourself unless you were deliberately degrading yourself. You used it about enemies, about people you wanted to destroy. The graffiti shows this pattern clearly. Marcus pedicavit Quintus appears on multiple walls in Pompeii. Marcus penetrated Quintus. This could be boasting or insulting Quintus or both. But you never find Quintus was penetrated by Marcus, phrased from Quintus's perspective as a positive thing. Never. The passive partner does not get to speak in his own voice. He is always the object, the one acted upon, silent, except in the Christian sources. And this is where something genuinely shifts. Early Christian martyrdom accounts, written in the 2nd and 3rd centuries, include stories of young Christian men refusing sexual advances from Roman authorities. These stories follow a pattern. A beautiful Christian boy is arrested. A Roman official offers to spare his life if he renounces Christianity and submits sexually. The boy refuses both, chooses death over both apostasy and sexual submission. And the text treats his refusal as heroic. His virginity is sacred. His body belongs to God. No Roman has the right to it, regardless of power or status. This was revolutionary. The idea that a young man, especially a slave or low-status person, could say no to sexual demands and be celebrated for it. Roman culture had no framework for this. If you were enslaved, if you were young, if someone powerful wanted you, you submitted. That was the natural order. Christianity said no. Your body is not property. Your consent matters. You can refuse. Of course, in the martyrdom stories, refusal leads to death. These boys are tortured and killed for their defiance. But the texts present their deaths as victories. They died pure, unviolated, triumphant over Roman sexual violence. For Christian communities, especially communities that included enslaved people and former prostitutes, these stories were powerful. They said your suffering matters. Your resistance matters. The people who abuse you will face divine judgment. One of the most famous is the story of St. Peleus, a young slave in a Roman household somewhere in the eastern provinces, probably Syria, around 250 CE. His master wanted him sexually. Peleus refused on the grounds that he was Christian, and his body was a temple of the Holy Spirit. The master beat him, threatened him, finally had him arrested by local authorities for refusing to sacrifice to the emperor. Peleus was tortured and executed, and early Christians treated him as a martyr, a saint. His refusal to submit sexually was remembered alongside his refusal to worship pagan gods. Both were forms of faithfulness. The story might be partly legendary. Most early Christian martyrdom accounts include exaggerations and miraculous elements, but the core dynamic is probably historical. Young Christian slaves did refuse sexual submission on religious grounds, and they paid for it with their lives. Their refusal was resistance, small-scale, individual, often ending in death, but resistance nonetheless. They were saying no to the entire Roman sexual system, claiming ownership of their own bodies. That was radical, and as Christianity spread, that radicalism spread with it. More communities teaching that sexual purity was possible, that exploitation was sin, that the powerful would face judgment. This was attractive to people trapped in the Roman system. Slaves, prostitutes, poor youth with no protection. Christianity offered them a narrative where they were not worthless, not degraded, not permanently stained by what had been done to them. They were beloved children of God. Their suffering was witnessed and would be avenged. But Christianity also taught that same-sex desire itself was sinful. Not just the exploitation, the desire. This was new. Romans did not condemn desire. They condemned acting on desire in the wrong way, in the wrong role, with the wrong person. But the desire itself was natural, universal. Christians said no. The desire is the problem. Lust is sin. Even thinking about another man sexually is corruption of the heart. This created a different kind of trap. Under Roman paganism, if you were a gay man, you could act on your desires as long as you maintained proper social hierarchy. Under Christianity, you could not act on your desires at all. You were expected to suppress them, deny them, seek divine help to eliminate them. And if you failed, if you gave in, you were a sinner. Damned. Hell awaited. For some gay men, this was worse than the Roman system. At least under paganism, there was a path. A way to live your sexuality within defined boundaries. Christianity offered no path, only denial or damnation. But for others, especially those who had been victims of the Roman system, Christianity offered relief. You do not have to be sexual at all. You can be celibate. You can join a monastery. You can dedicate your life to God and never have to think about sex again. For survivors of sexual trauma, that option was freedom, and some early Christian communities became refugees for people fleeing sexual exploitation. Men and women living together in chaste communal arrangements, sharing resources, protecting each other. No marriage, no sex, just mutual survival under divine protection. These communities were strange to Roman eyes, suspicious, but they persisted. And some of them probably included gay men who were grateful to find a life that did not require them to either exploit others or be exploited themselves. But most gay men in Rome were not Christians. Most continued navigating the pagan system, and that system continued functioning exactly as it had for centuries. The emperors kept their favorites, the poets kept writing, the bathhouses stayed full, the slave markets sold beautiful boys. Daily life continued. Even when individual emperors converted to Christianity, even when Christian bishops gained political power, the sexual culture changed slowly. Constantine converted in 312 CE, but he did not close the bathhouses. He did not free the slave boys. He passed some laws restricting prostitution and penalizing sexual immorality, but enforcement was minimal. The empire was too large, the bureaucracy too corrupt. Local officials ignored the laws or enforced them selectively against political enemies. Life continued as before. It took a century, from Constantine to Theodosius, 312 to 390. 3 generations of gradual Christianization before the laws started having real teeth. And even then, enforcement was inconsistent. The cities where bishops held power saw crackdowns. Prostitutes arrested. Brothels closed. Men accused of sexual deviance prosecuted. But in rural areas, in the provinces far from Rome and Constantinople, old patterns continued. The local landowner still had his slave boys. The bathhouse still operated. The authorities looked the other way, and some regions resisted Christianization entirely. Parts of Syria, rural Egypt, Britain at the empire's fringes. These places maintained pagan practices well into the 5th and 6th centuries, which meant they maintained pagan sexual norms too. The change was neither immediate nor universal. It was uneven, contested, violent in places. There are accounts of Christian mobs attacking bathhouses, breaking statues of gods associated with sexuality, beating men they accused of sexual immorality. Early Christianity could be brutal, intolerant. Once Christians gained political power, they used it to enforce their morality on everyone, and people resisted. Pagans fought back, sometimes literally. Religious riots were common in the 4th and 5th centuries. Christians attacking pagan temples, pagans attacking Christian churches. And sexuality was often part of the conflict. Christians condemning pagan sexual license, pagans mocking Christian sexual repression. The philosopher Libanius, a pagan writing in the late 4th century, complained bitterly about Christian sexual morality. He argued that Christianity was making men weak, fearful of their own desires. He defended traditional Roman sexuality as natural and healthy. This was a minority position by his time. Christianity was ascendant, but it shows that not everyone accepted the new order. Some men wanted to maintain the old ways, the freedom to desire and act without Christian guilt, but they were losing. By 400 CE, Christianity was the dominant religion. By 500 CE, It was essentially the only legal religion. Paganism survived in scattered pockets, in private households, but publicly it was gone. And with it went the sexual culture that had defined Rome for 1,000 years. The transition was mourning for some, liberation for others, and for most people, probably just confusing. The rules kept changing. What was acceptable under your grandfather was a crime under your father. What your father did in bathhouses was now punishable by death. The moral framework shifted faster than the culture could adapt, so people improvised, hid, adjusted, survived however they could. And through all of this, gay men continued existing, continued loving and desiring and finding each other. The structure changed around them, the language changed, the penalties changed, but the fundamental fact of same-sex desire did not change. It could not. It was part of human variation, had always been, would always be. What Rome really did to gay men was create one particular set of conditions under which they lived, sometimes openly, sometimes hidden, sometimes celebrated, sometimes punished, always negotiating, always navigating, always human. Rome was not unique in this. Every culture creates conditions, sets rules, defines boundaries, and gay people in every culture find ways to exist within, around, or against those boundaries. Rome's boundaries were unusual, permissive in some ways, brutal in others, built entirely around power and hierarchy. And that made Roman gay life simultaneously more visible than almost any other ancient culture, and more exploitative than we can easily comprehend today. Both things true at once. We cannot simplify it, cannot make it a neat story. It was messy, contradictory, human. The final century of the Western Roman Empire, from roughly 400 to 476 CE, was chaos. Barbarian invasions, economic collapse, the legions withdrawing from distant provinces, cities shrinking, trade routes disappearing. And in that chaos, the careful social hierarchies that had governed Roman sexuality for centuries began to break down. When the Visigoths sacked Rome in 410 CE, when the city that had ruled the world for a millennium was looted and burned, the old certainties died with it. The careful distinctions between citizen and non-citizen, between free and enslaved, between proper and improper sexual roles, all of that required a functioning social order to maintain. As the empire crumbled, so did the system. Slavery continued. But the slave trade broke down. Fewer military campaigns meant fewer captives. Fewer captives meant the supply of young enslaved boys dried up. The wealthy could no longer easily purchase the objects of their desire. Some freed their existing slaves because they could not afford to feed them. Others lost them when barbarian armies swept through, when cities were besieged, when households dissolved overnight. The entire infrastructure that had supported Roman sexual culture was collapsing. The bathhouses closed. Not because Christianity finally banned them, though that helped, but because cities could no longer maintain them. The aqueducts broke, the furnaces went cold, the marble cracked. Bathhouse culture, which had been the center of Roman male social and sexual life for centuries, simply ended. By 500 CE, the great thermae of Rome were abandoned ruins. Squatters lived in what had been social clubs. The pools were empty. The steam was gone. And with the bathhouses went one of the primary spaces where Roman men had met each other, cruised each other, negotiated desire. Now what? Where did men who wanted men go in a collapsing empire? They went underground, into private homes, into the remaining fragments of urban life, into whatever spaces survived the collapse. But the easy visibility was gone. The casual openness was gone. Everything became more difficult, more dangerous, more hidden. The Christian church filled the vacuum. As the Western Empire collapsed, as imperial authority dissolved, the bishops became the real power in many cities. They controlled what remained of social services. They distributed food. They negotiated with barbarian armies. They became the government. And they brought Christian sexual morality with them, enforced it, made it the law of the land. By the 6th century in the Eastern Roman Empire, the Byzantine Empire under Justinian, gay sex was explicitly criminalized with horrific penalties: castration, torture, public execution. Justinian prosecuted men accused of sodomy personally, had them paraded through Constantinople, made examples of them. The message was clear: this will not be tolerated. The old Roman permissiveness was dead. Christian sexual purity was the new order. But in the chaotic West, in the territories now controlled by Germanic kingdoms, enforcement was impossible. The legal apparatus did not exist. Christian bishops preached against sexual sin, but their authority was limited. Local warlords did whatever they wanted, and in the spaces between collapsing imperial authority and emerging medieval feudalism, people lived however they could. Some gay men probably found more freedom in the chaos: no emperor to enforce laws, no bureaucracy to prosecute, just small communities trying to survive. You could disappear into that, build a quiet life. As long as you were useful to your local lord, as long as you did not attract too much attention, you survived. Others found less freedom. Barbarian tribes had their own sexual norms, often more restrictive than late Roman ones. The Visigoths, the Vandals, the Ostrogoths. These peoples were Christianizing too, often in Arian forms that Roman bishops considered heretical, but still Christian, still carrying sexual prohibitions, still hostile to same-sex desire. When they took over Roman territories, they brought their rules with them. So the transition from Roman to medieval Europe was not a single moment. It was a long, messy, regionally variable process. In some places, Roman sexual culture lingered for generations. In others, it was stamped out immediately. The story is different in every province, every city, every valley. But the overall trajectory is clear. The openness ended. The visibility ended. The poetic celebration of male beauty and male desire ended. What replaced it was a Christian moral order that drove same-sex desire into secrecy, into sin, into the realm of the forbidden. And that order persisted for over 1,000 years. The Middle Ages, the Renaissance, the Reformation, the Enlightenment, all built on the assumption that gay sex was sinful, criminal, punishable by death. That assumption came from Christianity, and Christianity's sexual morality was born in the reaction against Roman sexual culture. So in a strange way, Rome's openness created its opposite. The very visibility of same-sex desire in Roman culture, the casual exploitation, the ubiquitous presence of gay sex in daily life, all of that horrified early Christians and motivated them to build a sexual system that was the inverse. Where Rome was permissive, Christianity was restrictive. Where Rome was visible, Christianity demanded invisibility. Where Rome celebrated male beauty, Christianity condemned lust, action and reaction. History swinging from one extreme to another. And the people caught in the middle, the ordinary gay men living through the transition, paid the price. The old freedoms disappeared, the new prohibitions arrived, and they had to navigate both, had to unlearn the casual openness of their youth and learn the rigid secrecy of the new order, had to hide desires that their grandfathers had expressed openly, had to survive in a world that was becoming increasingly hostile. Some did survive. We find traces, medieval documents mentioning 2 monks who were too close and were separated by their abbot. Court records of men accused of sodomy. Penitential manuals listing same-sex acts among the sins priests were supposed to ask about in confession. The evidence is fragmentary, hostile, written by people who wanted to condemn, but it proves continuity. Gay men did not disappear when Rome fell. They just became invisible to history, and that invisibility lasted until very recently, until the 20th century, until gay liberation movements began recovering lost histories, reclaiming erased stories, proving that we have always existed, in every culture, every era, every place. Rome is part of that proof. Uncomfortable proof sometimes. Evidence that our history includes not just love and resistance, but also exploitation and violence. That gay history is human history. Complex, contradictory, irreducible to simple narratives. So what do we do with Rome's legacy? How do we think about a culture that was simultaneously more open about gay sexuality than anything in the next 1500 years, and also built on systematic sexual exploitation? We hold the tension. We acknowledge that Rome shows us both possibility and danger. The possibility that same-sex desire can be socially visible, integrated into daily life, acknowledged in art and literature and law. That is valuable. That is part of why queer historians study Rome. We see ourselves in Catullus's poems, in the tombstones of companions who lived together for decades, in the bathhouse graffiti, in the evidence that men have always loved men and found ways to say so. But we also see the danger. What it means when desire is channeled entirely through power hierarchies, when sex is always about dominance and submission, when the people being desired have no voice, no choice, no protection. Rome shows us that visibility without equality is not liberation, that cultural acceptance of gay sex means nothing if that sex is predicated on exploitation, that representation without justice is hollow. The boys enslaved in Roman households were visible. Everyone saw them, everyone knew what was happening to them, and no one saved them. That is not a model to aspire to, that is a warning. So we learn from Rome selectively. We take the evidence of continuity, the proof that we have always existed, the examples of genuine affection that survived despite the brutal system, the soldiers who called each other my soul, the freedmen who held hands on their tombstone, the emperors who mourned their lovers. That is our history. We claim it, and we reject the exploitation. We name it clearly. We refuse to romanticize it. We do not excuse it because times were different, or that was their culture. We say plainly, enslaving children and raping them was wrong. It was wrong then. It is wrong now. The Romans who did it were committing atrocities. The system that enabled it was evil. Full stop. Both things can be true. Rome is part of queer history, and Rome was built on sexual violence. We carry both truths. We have to, because our history is not a simple story of oppression and liberation. It is a complicated human story, and Rome is one chapter, vital, problematic, undeniable. And here is what Rome ultimately teaches us. The structure matters more than the culture. Rome was gay-friendly in the sense that same-sex acts were visible and frequent, but the structure was violent, built on slavery, on hierarchy, on the absolute power of some men over other men's bodies. That structure made visibility possible, but it also made that visibility meaningless for the people at the bottom. They were seen, they were used, they were discarded. Modern queer liberation is trying to build something different. Visibility and equality, representation and justice, the right to be seen and the right to say no, the freedom to love and the freedom to refuse. Rome had the first part. It utterly lacked the second, and without both, there is no liberation, just a different form of oppression. So we do not want to return to Rome. We do not want a world where gay sex is everywhere, but only on the powerful's terms. We want something Rome never imagined. A world where two men of equal status can love each other openly, where power does not determine who gets to desire and who gets to be desired, where a boy can grow up knowing his body belongs to him, where old men are not mocked for wanting intimacy, where no one is property. Rome could not conceive of that world. Their entire civilization was built on hierarchy, on some people having rights and others having none, on power as the organizing principle of every human interaction, sex, politics, family, religion, all of it structured by who had power over whom. Imagining equality was impossible. They literally did not have the conceptual framework. We do. We have spent the last 2 centuries building the ideas that make equality thinkable: human rights, consent, bodily autonomy, the inherent dignity of every person regardless of status. These ideas would have been alien to Romans, laughable. They would have asked, how does a society function without hierarchy? How do you organize human relations without power? And we are still figuring out the answer. Still building systems that honor equality over hierarchy. Still failing sometimes. Still learning. But at least we are trying. At least we know what we are trying to build. Rome did not even know it was missing. So tonight, as you drift towards sleep, think about the distance we have traveled. From a world where enslaved boys were raped daily and poets wrote it into beautiful verses, to a world where we say that is wrong, where we have laws protecting children, where consent matters, where more and more people understand that power imbalances make true consent impossible. We are not there yet. We have not solved it, but we are trying. Think about the Roman soldiers who loved each other in secret, who wrote letters calling each other "my soul," and then burned them so no one would find out, who shared tents and battles and decades of life and could never say out loud what they meant to each other. They are your ancestors, queer ancestors who survived impossible circumstances, who found love anyway, who built lives in the cracks of an empire that saw them only as bodies to use or punish. Think about the gladiator who threw down his weapon rather than kill the man he loved. We do not know his name. We do not know if the story is even true or just legend, but someone told it. Someone thought it was believable that a man would choose death over killing his beloved. That tells you something about the power of love, even in Rome, even in the arena, even when the whole empire was screaming for blood. Think about Antinous, the most famous gay teenager in history, drowned in the Nile, deified by an emperor, immortalized in marble. We will never know if he was happy, if he loved Hadrian or just survived him, if his drowning was accident or suicide or something else entirely. We will never know what he thought, what he wanted, what his own story would have been if he had gotten to tell it. He is silent, forever beautiful, forever 17, forever marble. But you are not marble. You are alive. In a world where Antinous would have choices he never had, where the bathhouse attendant could say no, where the slave boy could report his abuser, where 2 men can hold hands on their tombstone and also hold hands walking down a street in daylight, where visibility and safety can coexist, sometimes, in some places, not everywhere yet, not for everyone, but more than ever before in history. That is what we owe the gay men of Rome, not to idealize them, not to ignore what was done to them and what they did to others, but to remember them, to say, you existed, you loved, you suffered, you survived, and because you survived, we are here. Your resilience, your stolen moments of joy, your hidden letters and secret gatherings and desperate refusals and quiet partnerships, all of that is woven into the fabric of queer history. You are part of us. We are part of you. Rome was not a paradise. It was an empire built on violence. But gay men lived in that empire, made lives there, loved there. That is the hidden truth. Not that Rome was secretly progressive, not that the past was better, but that we have always been here, in every system, every era, every impossible circumstance, finding each other, surviving, creating meaning in the margins, building community where none was allowed, loving against the odds. And we are still here, still surviving, still building, still loving. The empire fell, the bathhouses are ruins, the slaves are dust, the emperors are history, but queer people remain. We outlasted Rome. We will outlast whatever comes next, because we always have, because we always will. So as you fall asleep tonight, in your clean bed, in your safe home, in a world where being gay is no longer a death sentence in many places, spare a thought for the men who came before, the ones who were not safe, who had no protection, who lived and loved anyway. They would be astonished by your freedom, and you are only free because they survived long enough to pass something down, even if just the knowledge that we have always existed. That has always been enough. May your dreams be free of emperors and legions and marble cold enough to burn. May you sleep knowing that the worst of Rome is behind us, and the best of what we can build is still ahead. May you rest easy in the knowledge that love, somehow, against all odds, against empire and law and violence and time itself, love survives. It always has. Good night, and sleep well.